The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Windsor Castle as King Charles III stood at his office window, his weathered hands clasped tightly behind his back. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier than it did in this moment, as whispers of a palace crisis threatened to shake the very foundations of the monarchy he had waited decades to inherit. Sarah Henderson, the king's private secretary, entered the room with measured steps, her usually composed demeanor betraying hints of the stress that had consumed the palace staff for weeks. She carried a stack of newspapers, their headlines screaming accusations and speculation about the royal family's most beloved member, Catherine, Princess of Wales. "Your Majesty," Sarah began, her voice barely above a whisper, "the situation has escalated overnight. 3 more publications have picked up the story, and social media is—" She paused, searching for the right words. "It's unprecedented, sir." Charles turned from the window, his blue eyes reflecting a mixture of paternal concern and royal duty. At 75, he had witnessed countless scandals and crises, but nothing had prepared him for the delicate nature of this particular storm. The allegations surrounding Kate weren't just attacking a member of his family, they were threatening the carefully constructed image of stability and modernization that had taken years to build. The reports had started as whispers in the corridors of Buckingham Palace 3 weeks earlier. Staff members, speaking on condition of anonymity, had allegedly described tensions between Kate and other senior royals. The stories painted a picture of a woman struggling under the immense pressure of royal life, isolated and overwhelmed by expectations that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. What made these reports particularly devastating was their timing. Kate had become the golden thread that connected the traditional monarchy with a new generation of supporters. Her grace during public appearances, her dedication to charitable causes, and her apparent happiness in her role as a wife and mother had made her invaluable to the crown's public image. Any suggestion that she was unhappy or considering stepping back from her duties sent shockwaves through the establishment. Charles walked to his desk, where copies of the morning papers lay spread like evidence in a courtroom. Palace Insider, Kate's Secret Struggle, read one headline. Princess in Crisis, The Truth Behind Closed Doors, declared another. Each article was carefully worded to avoid direct accusations while painting a picture of a woman on the edge of a breakdown. The king's mind wandered to his own experiences with media scrutiny during his younger years. The relentless attention, the constant judgment, the way every gesture was analyzed and interpreted had nearly broken him at times. He thought of Diana and the tragic consequences of a life lived under such intense public pressure. The parallel was too painful to contemplate, yet impossible to ignore. "Have we heard from William this morning?" Charles asked, settling into his chair with the careful movements of a man carrying invisible burdens. "Prince William is en route from Norfolk, Your Majesty." "He should arrive within the hour," Sarah replied, consulting her phone for the latest updates from the Prince of Wales's security detail. The relationship between Charles and his eldest son had evolved dramatically since the Queen's passing and Charles's accession to the throne. What had once been a sometimes strained father-son dynamic had transformed into a partnership built on mutual respect and shared responsibility. William understood the weight of his future role, and Charles had come to rely on his son's judgment and modern perspective on royal duties. But this crisis tested even their strengthened bond. William was caught between his loyalty to his father and the monarchy, and his fierce protection of his wife and children. The reports suggested that Kate was struggling with aspects of royal life that couldn't be easily fixed with protocol adjustments or staff changes. If the allegations were true, they spoke to fundamental questions about the sustainability of the modern monarchy's demands on its members. Charles picked up the most damaging of the morning's articles, published in a respected broadsheet that typically maintained a respectful distance from royal gossip. The piece, written by the paper's royal correspondent, cited multiple unnamed sources describing Kate as increasingly withdrawn and questioning her place within the institution. Most troubling was a quote from someone described as its senior palace aide who claimed that Kate had been overheard saying she never imagined it would be this suffocating. The king set down the paper and rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar tension headache that had become his constant companion since taking the throne. Every decision he made now carried implications that rippled far beyond the palace walls. How he handled this crisis would set the tone for his reign and, potentially, determine the monarchy's relationship with the public for years to come. The irony wasn't lost on him that Kate, who had been seen as the monarchy's secret weapon in maintaining relevance with younger generations, was now at the center of its most serious crisis in years. Her relatability and apparent normalcy had been carefully cultivated assets, but they also made her more vulnerable to the kind of human struggles that the institution traditionally preferred to keep hidden. Charles thought about his late mother, Queen Elizabeth II, and how she might have handled such a situation. Her approach would have been characterized by silence, dignity, and an unwavering belief that royal duty superseded personal feelings. But Charles had witnessed firsthand how that approach had sometimes failed his family members, particularly during his own marriage to Diana and the subsequent years of public scrutiny. The king's reflection was interrupted by the sound of cars arriving in the castle's courtyard. Through his window, he could see the familiar outline of William's security convoy, the black vehicles forming a precise formation that spoke to the seriousness of the situation. His son would be feeling the weight of protecting both his family's privacy and the monarchy's reputation, a balance that had proven impossible for many royals throughout history. As he waited for William to make his way through the castle's corridors, Charles considered the advice he had received from his most trusted advisors over the past few days. Some urged him to issue a strong denial of all reports, to characterize them as malicious gossip designed to destabilize the monarchy. Others suggested a more nuanced approach, acknowledging the pressures faced by all royal family members while reaffirming Kate's commitment to her role. The challenge was that any response, or lack thereof, would be scrutinized and interpreted as confirmation or denial of the underlying allegations. The palace's traditional policy of never complain, never explain seemed inadequate when faced with such specific and damaging claims about a family member's well-being. Charles stood as he heard footsteps approaching his office door. The next few hours would be crucial in determining not just how this immediate crisis was resolved, but how the monarchy adapted to an age where privacy was increasingly elusive and public expectations for transparency continued to grow. The knock on the door came with the familiar rhythm that Charles recognized as his son's. As William entered the room, his face bore the same mixture of determination and concern that Charles had seen in the mirror that morning. Father and son, king and heir, they faced a challenge that would test everything they believed about duty, family, and the price of public service. The conversation that was about to unfold would shape not just their family's future, but the very nature of the institution they were sworn to serve and protect. In a world where royal life was lived under an increasingly powerful microscope, they had to find a way to protect those they loved while fulfilling obligations that stretched back centuries. Outside the castle walls, the media circus continued to grow, with news vans and photographers gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. The story of Kate's alleged crisis had captured the public imagination in a way that few royal stories had in recent years, combining the fascination with celebrity culture, the sympathy for a relatable young mother, and the eternal questions about what it truly meant to be royal in the 21st century. As William took his seat across from his father's desk, both men understood that the decisions made in this room would echo through history, affecting not just their own family, but the thousands of people whose livelihoods depended on the monarchy's continued relevance and the millions of citizens who looked to the royal family as a symbol of stability in an uncertain world. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier, but it was a burden they would bear together, as family and as servants of something larger than themselves. Prince William closed the heavy oak door behind him and moved across the Persian carpet with the measured gait of a man carrying invisible weights. His father's office, with its portraits of monarchs past and present, had always felt like a sanctuary of sorts, but today the familiar space seemed charged with an urgency that made the very air feel thick with unspoken tensions. "Father," William began, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions churning beneath his carefully maintained composure. The formality of the address reflected not distance, but the gravity of their situation. In these walls, they were not simply Charles and William, but king and heir, bound by duties that transcended their personal relationship. Charles gestured to the chair across from his desk, the same seat where William had received guidance on everything from protocol to personal matters throughout his adult life. But this conversation would be different from any they had shared before. The stakes were higher, the implications more far-reaching, and the potential for damage more devastating than either man wanted to acknowledge. "I've been in contact with Catherine since dawn," William continued, settling into the chair and, immediately leaning forward, his hands clasped together in a gesture that mirrored his father's earlier stance. "The reports, there's enough truth woven through the lies to make this particularly dangerous." The admission hung in the air between them like a confession. For weeks, the palace's strategy had been to dismiss the allegations as unfounded speculation, but William's words confirmed what Charles had feared. The media had found a vein of truth, however small, and were mining it for maximum impact. Charles studied his son's face, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the tension in his jaw that spoke to sleepless nights and difficult conversations. William had always been protective of his family, but the intensity of his devotion to Kate and their children had deepened over the years, creating a fierce loyalty that sometimes put him at odds with royal protocol. "Tell me," Charles said simply, his voice carrying the weight of both paternal concern and royal authority. William took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts in the methodical way he had learned during his military service. "Kate has been struggling more than we've let on. Not with her duties or her commitment to the crown, but with the isolation that comes with this life. She's felt disconnected from who she was before, trapped between the woman she is and the image everyone expects her to maintain." The words carried an echo of conversations that had taken place behind closed doors at Anmer Hall, where William and Kate had sought refuge from the relentless pace of royal life. Those private moments, meant to be sacred and protected, had somehow found their way into public discourse, filtered through unnamed sources and transformed into weapons against the institution they served. Charles nodded slowly, recognizing in William's description something achingly familiar. The transformation from private citizen to public figure was never easy, but, for those who married into the royal family, the adjustment could be particularly brutal. Kate had navigated it with apparent grace for over a decade, but even the strongest facades could crack under sustained pressure. "The children?" Charles asked, his grandfather's heart temporarily overriding his royal concerns. "They're aware something is happening, but we've shielded them as much as possible," William replied. "George asks questions about why there are more photographers following us lately. Charlotte notices when Kate seems sad, even when we think we're hiding it well. Louis is young enough to be largely oblivious, thank God." The mention of his grandchildren brought a fresh wave of protective instinct to Charles's chest. George, at 10, was old enough to understand that his life was different from his classmates, but still young enough to be hurt by the kind of speculation currently swirling around his mother. Charlotte, with her perceptive nature, would undoubtedly sense the tension even if she couldn't fully comprehend its source. "What triggered this latest round of stories?" Charles asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. William's expression darkened. "Last month's charity event at the Royal Opera House." Kate had what she thought was a private conversation with Lady Morrison about the challenges of balancing royal duties with motherhood. She was honest about feeling overwhelmed sometimes, about questioning whether she was doing enough for the children while fulfilling her obligations to the crown. Charles closed his eyes briefly, imagining how such an innocuous conversation between two mothers could be twisted into evidence of a deeper crisis. The royal family's greatest challenge had always been the impossibility of authentic human connection when every word might be scrutinized, recorded, or reported. "Lady Morrison?" Charles inquired, though he already suspected she wasn't the source of the leak. "Absolutely not," William confirmed quickly. But conversations in those settings have a way of traveling through multiple sources until they reach someone willing to share them with the press. By the time Kate's words reached the newspapers, they had been transformed from a moment of maternal honesty into evidence of institutional breakdown. The phenomenon William described was one that every royal family member understood but could never fully defend against. Their lives existed in a series of concentric circles, from the intimate family core to the broader network of aristocrats, officials, and staff who surrounded them. Information flowed through these circles like water finding cracks in stone, sometimes innocent, sometimes malicious, but always potentially dangerous. Charles picked up a fountain pen from his desk and turned it slowly between his fingers, a nervous habit he had developed during stressful negotiations. The palace's response so far has been inadequate, he admitted. We've been treating this as a traditional scandal when it's actually something more complex. The old playbook doesn't work anymore, William agreed. People can sense when we're being dishonest, and complete silence feels like confirmation of guilt. But we also can't expose Kate to more scrutiny by addressing every allegation. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Sarah Henderson entered with a tea service, her presence a reminder that even the most private royal conversations required the support of trusted staff. She set the tray down with practiced efficiency, her face carefully neutral despite the obvious tension in the room. Sir, she addressed Charles quietly, the Prime Minister's office has called twice in the past hour. They're requesting an urgent briefing on the situation. Charles and William exchanged glances. Government involvement in royal crises was always delicate, requiring careful navigation between the monarchy's independence and its constitutional role within the broader political system. The Prime Minister's interest suggested that the story had reached a level of national importance that couldn't be ignored. Schedule a call for this afternoon, Charles instructed. After we've had time to develop our approach. As Sarah departed, closing the door behind her, father and son found themselves alone again with the weight of decisions that would affect far more than their immediate family. The monarchy's relationship with the British people had evolved dramatically over the decades, but certain expectations remained constant: strength, dignity, and the appearance of unity in the face of adversity. Kate wants to address the situation directly, William revealed, his voice carrying a note of both pride and concern. She's drafted a statement explaining her perspective, acknowledging the challenges while reaffirming her commitment to her role. Charles looked up sharply. A personal statement? That's unprecedented for a situation like this. Everything about this situation is unprecedented, William replied. The traditional approach assumes that silence will eventually lead to the story fading away. But social media has changed the rules. The speculation feeds on itself, growing more dramatic with each day we don't respond. The Prince of Wales made a compelling point. The modern media landscape operated on different principles than the environment in which previous royal scandals had unfolded. Stories no longer followed predictable cycles of interest and decline. Instead, they could be sustained indefinitely by online communities that dissected every aspect of royal life with forensic intensity. Charles considered the implications of Kate speaking for herself. On one hand, it would demonstrate transparency and authenticity, qualities that modern audiences increasingly demanded from public figures. On the other hand, it would set a precedent that could fundamentally alter how the royal family managed future crises. What does Catherine propose to say? Charles asked, his use of Kate's formal name reflecting the official nature of their discussion. William reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. She's written it herself, without input from the communications team. She wanted it to be completely authentic. As Charles unfolded the document, he was struck by Kate's handwriting, elegant but with subtle signs of the stress she had been experiencing. The words on the page would either help resolve their current crisis or create an entirely new set of challenges. The statement began with an acknowledgement of the speculation surrounding her well-being and a gentle correction of the most egregious misrepresentations. But it was Kate's honest discussion of the challenges faced by all parents trying to balance professional obligations with family life that gave the statement its power. She had found a way to be vulnerable without appearing weak, human without compromising her royal dignity. This could work, Charles murmured, impressed despite his initial reservations. But it's also a significant risk. Once we open this door, there's no closing it again. Kate understands that, William replied. She's not proposing this lightly. But, she believes that authenticity is the only way forward, that people can sense when we're being honest and, when we're hiding behind institutional speak. Charles set down the statement and looked at his son with a mixture of admiration and concern. William had inherited many of his mother Diana's instincts about connecting with the public, but he had also learned from the tragic consequences of that connection when it came into conflict with royal protocol. The king stood and walked to the window again, watching as the media presence outside the castle gates continued to grow. Each additional news van represented thousands of people waiting for answers, for reassurance, or simply for the next development in a story that had captured the nation's attention. If we do this, Charles said slowly, we need to be prepared for every word to be analyzed, every gesture to be interpreted, every pause to be given meaning. Kate would be stepping into a level of scrutiny that even she hasn't experienced before. She's already experiencing that scrutiny, William pointed out. The difference is that right now, other people are controlling the narrative. This would give her the chance to speak for herself. The conversation was reaching a crucial decision point. Charles could feel the weight of history pressing down on them, the sense that their choice in this moment would be remembered and analyzed by future generations of royals facing their own crises. Outside, the late morning sun continued its arc across the sky, indifferent to the human drama unfolding within the ancient walls of Windsor Castle. But, inside, a father and son grappled with questions that went to the heart of what it meant to be royal in an age when the old certainties no longer provided adequate guidance. The next phase of their conversation would determine not just how they addressed the immediate crisis, but how the monarchy itself evolved to meet the challenges of a new era. The afternoon light filtering through the tall windows of Windsor Castle had taken on a golden quality that reminded Charles of childhood memories, when the weight of the crown was still his mother's burden and his own future seemed distant and abstract. Now, as he sat across from William in the same office where countless royal crises had been managed over the decades, he felt the full gravity of decisions that would reshape not just their family's immediate future, but the monarchy's relationship with a rapidly changing world. Kate's proposed statement lay between them on the desk, its pages slightly wrinkled from multiple readings and careful consideration. The words were deceptively simple, but Charles understood that simplicity often carried the greatest power. His daughter-in-law had managed to address the swirling allegations while maintaining her dignity, acknowledging human struggles without appearing weak, and reaffirming her commitment to her role without sounding defensive. Before we proceed, Charles said, reaching for his secure phone, I think we need to hear directly from Catherine herself. This affects her more than anyone else. William nodded, understanding that despite their good intentions, two men discussing a woman's public statement without her direct input reflected exactly the kind of institutional thinking that had contributed to their current situation. The monarchy's historical tendency to manage its female members rather than empower them was a legacy that needed to change. The call connected after 2 rings, and Kate's voice filled the room through the speakerphone, steady despite the strain that Charles could detect beneath her composed tone. She was calling from Anmer Hall, where she had retreated with the children after the morning school run, seeking the sanctuary that their Norfolk home provided away from London's intense scrutiny. Your Majesty, William, Kate began, using the formal address that protocol required even in private family conversations during times of crisis. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Catherine, my dear, Charles replied, his voice softening with genuine paternal warmth, nothing is more important than ensuring you feel supported through this difficult time. William has shared your proposed statement with me, and I wanted to discuss it with you directly. There was a pause on the line, and Charles could imagine Kate taking one of the deep breaths she used to center herself before public appearances. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of determination that reminded him why she had become such an invaluable member of their family. I've thought about this constantly for the past week, Kate said. Every option feels like it comes with significant risks, but I've reached the conclusion that silence is the most dangerous choice of all. The speculation is affecting not just me, but William, the children, and the institution itself. Charles appreciated her directness. Kate had always possessed an analytical mind that complemented her emotional intelligence, a combination that made her particularly effective in her royal role. She understood both the human cost of their situation and its broader implications for the monarchy's public standing. "Walk me through your thinking," Charles requested, settling back in his chair and giving her his complete attention. "The current narrative paints me as either a victim of institutional pressure or someone ungrateful for the privileges I've been given," Kate explained. "Both characterizations are fundamentally false, but they've taken on a life of their own because we haven't provided an alternative perspective." William leaned forward, his pride in his wife evident despite the stress lines around his eyes. "She's right, father. The vacuum of information is being filled by speculation that grows more extreme each day." Kate continued, her voice gaining strength as she articulated thoughts she had clearly spent considerable time developing. "I want people to understand that questioning and struggling are normal human responses to extraordinary circumstances. The royal family isn't immune to doubt or emotional challenges, and pretending otherwise makes us seem disconnected from the realities that ordinary families face." Charles found himself nodding, recognizing in Kate's words an echo of conversations he had had with his own advisors about modernizing the monarchy's approach to public communication. The institution's traditional reserve, which had served it well for centuries, sometimes created barriers between the royal family and the people they served. "What about the children?" Charles asked, his grandfather's instincts surfacing. "How do we protect them from increased scrutiny?" "That's my primary concern," Kate admitted. "But I've realized that the current situation already exposes them to speculation and analysis. At least if I speak for myself, I can control the message and, hopefully, redirect attention away from them." The logic was sound, though Charles understood the emotional toll it would take on Kate to open herself to even more public examination. The courage required to step forward when every instinct demanded retreat spoke to the strength of character that had made her such an asset to the monarchy. "There's something else," Kate added, her tone becoming more personal. "I've received hundreds of messages from women who identify with the struggles described in the media reports. Many of them are also trying to balance demanding careers with motherhood, dealing with public pressure, or questioning their life choices. If my speaking honestly helps even some of them feel less alone, isn't that worthwhile?" Charles felt a stirring of recognition. Kate had identified something that went beyond their immediate crisis, an opportunity to connect with people in a way that strengthened rather than weakened the monarchy's relevance. The royal family's value had always been partly symbolic, representing ideals and aspirations that resonated with the broader population. "The communications team has concerns," William interjected, his tone suggesting he had already had lengthy discussions with the palace's media advisors. "They worry about precedent, about opening floodgates for future situations." "I understand their concerns," Kate replied, "but precedent should evolve with changing circumstances. The communication strategies that worked in previous decades may not be adequate for today's media environment." Charles considered the broader implications of Kate's proposal. If successful, her statement could demonstrate that the royal family was capable of authentic engagement with contemporary challenges. If it backfired, however, it could expose them to even more invasive scrutiny and potentially damage the institution's carefully maintained mystique. "Catherine," Charles said slowly, "I want you to understand that if we proceed with this approach, there will be no going back. The level of attention, the analysis of every word, the expectation for continued transparency will become permanent features of your public role." "I've already lost my privacy," Kate responded with a slight laugh that contained no humor. "The current situation has made that clear. At least if I speak for myself, I maintain some control over my own narrative." Charles looked at William, seeing in his son's expression the same mixture of protectiveness and admiration that he felt himself. Kate had evolved from the somewhat shy young woman who had married into their family into someone capable of making strategic decisions that balanced personal authenticity with institutional needs. "There's another consideration," Charles added. "The government's interest in this situation suggests it has implications beyond our family. How we handle this crisis may affect public confidence in the monarchy as an institution. Which is exactly why silence isn't an option," Kate replied. If people believe the royal family is falling apart internally, it undermines everything we're trying to accomplish publicly. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of children's voices in the background, and Kate's tone immediately shifted to the warmer, more relaxed register she used with George, Charlotte, and Louis. Charles heard her covering the phone's microphone as she spoke to them, probably arranging their afternoon activities or addressing some minor crisis that seemed monumental in their young lives. When Kate returned to the call, her voice carried a note of maternal determination that Charles found both touching and powerful. "They're the reason I'm willing to take this risk," she said simply. "I want them to grow up knowing that their mother stood up for herself and her family when it mattered." Charles felt a wave of paternal pride, not just for his daughter-in-law, but for the woman his son had chosen to share his life and eventual crown. Kate's proposal represented exactly the kind of thoughtful modernization that the monarchy needed to remain relevant in the 21st century. "What timeline are you considering?" Charles asked, his question indicating a shift toward practical planning rather than theoretical discussion. "I'd like to release the statement tomorrow morning," Kate replied. "Waiting longer gives the current speculation more time to grow, and Friday afternoon releases tend to get lost in weekend news cycles." William checked his phone for the latest media reports. The story is gaining momentum internationally now. The American networks picked it up this morning, and there are photographers outside Eton asking about George. The mention of photographers near his grandson's school triggered a protective anger in Charles that he quickly suppressed. The intrusion into the children's lives was exactly the kind of consequence he had hoped to avoid, but it also reinforced Kate's argument that their current strategy wasn't working. "Very well," Charles said, his decision crystallizing as they spoke. "But I want to make some modifications to ensure we're presenting a united front as a family." Kate's relief was audible in her voice. "What did you have in mind?" "William and I will issue our own statement simultaneously, expressing our complete support for you and acknowledging the challenges faced by all members of the royal family. We turn this into a demonstration of family unity rather than leaving you to address the situation alone." The proposal transformed Kate's individual response into a coordinated family effort, spreading the risk while reinforcing their solidarity. It also positioned Charles and William as supportive rather than protective, allowing Kate to maintain her agency while benefiting from institutional backing. "That's perfect," Kate said, and Charles could hear the smile in her voice. "It addresses the concerns about precedent while still allowing me to speak authentically about my own experience." As they began discussing the practical details of coordinating three separate but complementary statements, Charles felt a cautious optimism building. The approach they were developing represented a significant evolution in royal crisis management, but it felt organic rather than forced, authentic rather than calculated. The afternoon sun was beginning to set over Windsor's ancient walls as they finalized their plans, casting long shadows that reminded Charles of the weight of history that surrounded every royal decision. But, for the first time since the crisis began, he felt they were moving toward a solution that honored both their personal values and their institutional responsibilities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and unprecedented scrutiny, but they would face them together, as a family united in their commitment to serving something larger than themselves while remaining true to their own humanity. The pre-dawn hours at Buckingham Palace carried a particular quality of stillness that Charles had come to treasure during his months as king. It was in these quiet moments, before the machinery of monarchy fully awakened, that he often found clarity amid the complexities of royal life. But, this morning, as he sat in his private study reviewing the final drafts of three carefully crafted statements, the silence felt charged with anticipation rather than peaceful. Kate's statement lay before him on his desk, her handwritten original now transformed into the formal document that would be released to the world in just a few hours. Reading her words again, Charles was struck by their power to transform vulnerability into strength, to acknowledge human frailty without compromising royal dignity. She had managed to speak as both a mother and a princess, addressing universal concerns while maintaining the particular grace required of her position. The coordinated response they had developed represented more than crisis management, it was a fundamental shift in how the royal family would engage with public scrutiny. Charles's own statement positioned him as a father supporting his daughter-in-law while acknowledging the broader challenges faced by all family members in their unique circumstances. William's contribution struck a perfect balance between protecting his wife and demonstrating their partnership in both personal and official matters. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts, and his private secretary entered with the morning's newspapers and a steaming cup of Earl Grey tea. The headlines were as expected. Speculation had reached fever pitch overnight, with some publications suggesting that Kate might step back from royal duties entirely. The stories had taken on a life of their own, growing more dramatic with each retelling. "Sir," his secretary said quietly, "the communications team is standing by to coordinate the release. The Prime Minister's office has also confirmed their full support for your approach." Charles nodded, grateful for the government's backing but aware that political support, while helpful, couldn't guarantee public reception of their unprecedented transparency. They were venturing into uncharted territory, guided by instinct and principle rather than established protocol. His phone buzzed with a text message from William. "Kate slept better than she has in weeks. She's ready for this." The simple words carried enormous emotional weight, reminding Charles that behind all the strategic considerations lay a young woman who had been struggling under pressures that would challenge anyone. At Amer Hall, Kate was indeed experiencing a sense of calm that had eluded her for months. The decision to speak for herself had lifted a weight she hadn't fully realized she was carrying. For too long, she had felt like a character in other people's stories about her life, watched and analyzed but not heard. Today, she would reclaim her own narrative. She stood in her kitchen, preparing breakfast for the children with the same methodical care she brought to all her maternal duties. George was already dressed in his school uniform, chattering about an upcoming football match while spreading jam on his toast with characteristic 10-year-old enthusiasm. Charlotte sat beside him, her perceptive eyes occasionally studying her mother's face with the intuitive concern that had marked her personality since she was very small. "Mummy," Charlotte said during a brief lull in George's football commentary, "are you feeling better today?" Kate paused in her preparation of Louis's breakfast, struck by her daughter's ability to sense emotional undercurrents that the adults thought they were hiding. "Yes, darling," she replied, sitting down beside Charlotte and smoothing a strand of hair away from her face. "Sometimes grown-ups need to have difficult conversations, but I'm feeling much better about everything now." Charlotte nodded solemnly, accepting the explanation with the trust that children place in parents they know love them unconditionally. "Will the photographers go away soon?" The question pierced Kate's heart. Her 8-year-old daughter shouldn't have to worry about photographers, shouldn't have to modify her behavior based on the presence of cameras and strangers seeking glimpses into their private lives. But this was the reality of their existence, and Kate had learned that honesty, presented appropriately for their ages, served her children better than false reassurances. "Some of them will probably always be around," Kate admitted, "but hopefully they'll be less interested in following us everywhere once people understand that we're just a normal family trying to do our best." The conversation was interrupted by William's arrival from his morning run, his appearance in the kitchen bringing the comfortable energy that always surrounded their family moments. Despite the pressure they were under, despite the unprecedented decision they were about to implement, their morning routine maintained the normalcy that grounded them all. "Ready for the big day?" William asked Kate quietly while the children finished their breakfast, his question carrying layers of meaning that went beyond the simple words. "More ready than I've felt about anything in a long time," Kate replied, and William could see that she meant it. The uncertainty and anxiety that had clouded her expressions for weeks had been replaced by a determination that reminded him of the qualities that had first attracted him to her years ago. Meanwhile, at Windsor Castle, Charles was conducting his final review of the coordination plan with his senior staff. The 3 statements would be released simultaneously at 9 a.m., followed by a carefully orchestrated series of briefings designed to provide context without creating additional controversy. Every detail had been planned to minimize misinterpretation while maximizing the impact of their united front. "The international media response will be particularly important," his communications director noted. This approach could influence how royal families worldwide handle similar situations in the future. Charles understood the broader implications. The British royal family's actions were often seen as precedents by other monarchies, and their decision to embrace transparency rather than traditional discretion would be studied and, potentially emulated. The responsibility was daunting, but he believed they were making the right choice for their circumstances and their time. At exactly 9 a.m., as London began its daily rhythm of commutes and commerce, 3 statements appeared simultaneously on the royal family's official social media accounts and website. The coordination was seamless, presenting a united front that immediately distinguished their response from typical royal crisis management. Kate's statement led with a simple acknowledgement: "Recent reports about my well-being have contained enough truth to concern me, enough fiction to frustrate me, and enough speculation to worry my family." The opening line immediately captured attention while establishing her agency in addressing the situation herself. She continued by acknowledging that royal life presented unique challenges, but emphasized that these challenges were ones she had chosen and continued to embrace. "The balance between public service and private life is something every working parent struggles with," she wrote. "The scale may be different in our family, but the fundamental questions are universal. How do we give our best to our work while being present for our children? How do we serve others while maintaining our own well-being? How do we stay true to ourselves while fulfilling the expectations others have of us?" The statement's power lay in its relatability. Kate had managed to acknowledge her struggles without appearing weak, to admit uncertainty without compromising her commitment, and to claim her humanity without diminishing her royal role. She closed by thanking people for their concern while reaffirming her dedication to the causes and duties she had embraced as a member of the royal family. Charles's statement, released simultaneously, struck a complimentary tone. "As a father and, as king, I am proud of Catherine's courage in addressing these matters with such honesty and grace," he wrote. "The pressures faced by all members of our family are real, and we support each other through them as any family would. Catherine's dedication to her role and her family is evident to all who know her, and I am honored to have her as both a daughter-in-law and as a valued member of our royal household." William's contribution focused on their partnership and shared values. "Catherine and I entered this life together, and we face its challenges together," his statement read. "Her strength, her compassion, and her commitment to our family and our duties inspire me every day. The speculation about our family's well-being has been difficult for all of us, but it has also reminded us of how fortunate we are to serve alongside people who understand both the privileges and the responsibilities of this remarkable life." The immediate response was unprecedented in both scale and tone. Within minutes of the releases, social media platforms were flooded with supportive messages from people who appreciated the royal family's honesty and relatability. News organizations scrambled to analyze statements that defied traditional royal communication patterns, finding themselves reporting on transparency rather than speculation. The shift in narrative was immediate and dramatic. Instead of focusing on alleged crises and institutional failures, media coverage turned to discussions about modern parenting, work-life balance, and the evolving nature of public service. Kate had successfully redirected the conversation from palace intrigue to universal human experiences. But the most significant impact was felt within the royal family itself. By speaking honestly about their experiences, they had created space for more authentic relationships with both the public and each other. The statements represented not just crisis management, but a fundamental evolution in how they would engage with the world going forward. As the morning progressed and the positive response became clear, Charles felt a sense of relief mixed with pride. They had taken an enormous risk, but it appeared to be paying off in ways that went beyond simply resolving their immediate crisis. They had demonstrated that the monarchy could be both dignified and human, both traditional and adaptable. The success of their approach would have lasting implications, establishing new precedents for royal transparency while maintaining the essential dignity that their positions required. But, more importantly for Charles as a father and grandfather, they had shown that protecting their family members meant empowering them to speak for themselves rather than speaking for them. The crisis that had threatened to destabilize their family had instead become an opportunity to strengthen both their personal bonds and their connection with the people they served. In choosing honesty over tradition, vulnerability over invulnerability, they had discovered a new model for royal service that honored both their humanity and their heritage. 3 weeks after the coordinated statements that had transformed a potential catastrophe into an unexpected triumph, Charles stood once again at the window of his Windsor Castle office. But, this time, the view told a different story. The media encampment that had grown like a persistent shadow outside the castle gates had dwindled to a manageable presence of regular royal correspondents. The crisis atmosphere had been replaced by something approaching normalcy, though Charles understood that the changes they had implemented would have lasting effects far beyond the immediate resolution of their troubles. The morning newspapers lay spread across his desk, but their tone had shifted dramatically from the speculation and alarm of previous weeks. Headlines now focused on Kate's upcoming charity engagement and the positive response to a new initiative she had launched for supporting working mothers. The transformation in media coverage reflected a broader shift in how the public perceived the royal family, less as untouchable figures existing above ordinary concerns, and more as dedicated public servants who happened to share the same fundamental human experiences as everyone else. Kate's decision to speak honestly about her struggles had opened floodgates of support that surprised even the most optimistic predictions. Letters and emails poured into Buckingham Palace from people across the Commonwealth and beyond, sharing their own stories of balancing demanding careers with family responsibilities, of questioning life choices while remaining committed to their paths, of finding strength through vulnerability. The response had revealed something profound about the public's hunger for authenticity from their public figures. The office door opened to admit William, but his demeanor was markedly different from the stressed and protective stance he had maintained during the crisis. Today he moved with the confident ease of someone whose primary concerns had been addressed, whose family was secure, and whose partnership with his wife had been strengthened rather than strained by their public ordeal. The latest polling numbers came in this morning, William announced, settling into his familiar chair across from his father's desk. Support for the monarchy has actually increased since the statements were released. More importantly, the approval ratings for Catherine specifically have reached unprecedented levels. Charles smiled, though he was careful not to let the positive numbers overshadow the more important personal victories they had achieved. The numbers are gratifying, but I'm more interested in how Catherine herself is feeling about the aftermath. She's been remarkable, William replied, his pride evident in both his voice and his expression. The decision to speak for herself seems to have lifted a weight that had been building for months. She's more relaxed during public appearances, more confident in her interactions with the press, and more comfortable with the level of attention our family receives. The transformation in Kate had been visible to anyone who observed her recent public engagements. Where once there had been a careful composure that sometimes seemed brittle under intense scrutiny, there was now a more natural grace that came from knowing she had successfully advocated for herself when it mattered most. The experience had revealed reserves of strength that even she might not have known she possessed. Charles picked up a letter from the stack of correspondence his staff had selected for his personal review. It was from a single mother in Manchester who had written to thank Kate for making her feel less alone in her struggles to balance career advancement with child-rearing responsibilities. The letter was one of thousands that had arrived since Kate's statement, each representing a connection forged through shared human experience rather than royal mystique. The children have noticed the change too, William continued. George asked Kate yesterday if the worried time was over. Charlotte has been more relaxed about public appearances, and even Louis seems to sense that the atmosphere around family outings has improved. The mention of his grandchildren brought Charles a particular satisfaction. Throughout the crisis, his primary concern had been protecting them from the adult complexities that threatened to intrude on their childhood. The successful resolution meant they could continue growing up with the security that came from knowing their parents were strong enough to handle whatever challenges their unique circumstances might present. A knock on the door announced the arrival of Kate herself, scheduled to join their weekly family coordination meeting. As she entered the office, Charles was struck by the vitality in her demeanor, the absence of the subtle tension that had marked her presence during the difficult weeks when she felt trapped between competing expectations and obligations. "Your Majesty, William," she greeted them, settling into a chair that had been added to their usual configuration to accommodate her increased involvement in strategic discussions. The crisis had demonstrated the value of including her perspective in decisions that affected the family's public role, leading to a more collaborative approach to royal planning. "Catherine," Charles responded warmly, "I was just telling William how impressed I've been with your recent engagements. The response to your working mother's initiative has been extraordinary." Kate's smile reflected genuine satisfaction rather than mere politeness. "It feels wonderful to focus on substantive work rather than managing speculation about my state of mind. The conversations I'm having now with the women we're trying to help are so much more meaningful when I can be honest about my own experiences with the challenges they're facing." The initiative Kate had launched was a direct outgrowth of her decision to speak honestly about her struggles. By acknowledging her own difficulties with work-life balance, she had created space to address these issues as matters of public policy rather than personal failure. The program provided flexible work arrangements, childcare support, and career development opportunities for mothers in demanding professions, with particular focus on public service roles. "The international response has been equally interesting," William noted. "We've had inquiries from royal families in Sweden, Belgium, and the Netherlands about our approach to transparency. It seems we may have started something larger than we initially realized." Charles nodded thoughtfully. The decision to break with traditional royal crisis management had indeed created ripples that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances. Other monarchies were grappling with similar questions about how to maintain relevance and connection with increasingly democratic populations that expected authenticity from their public figures. "There have been some unexpected benefits as well," Kate added. "The honest conversation about royal life seems to have made people more appreciative of what we do rather than taking it for granted. When you acknowledge that something requires effort and sacrifice, people value it more than when it appears effortless." The observation touched on something fundamental about public service in the modern era. The old royal model of appearing above human concerns and limitations had created distance that sometimes translated into irrelevance. By acknowledging their humanity, the royal family had actually enhanced rather than diminished their symbolic value. Charles looked at his son and daughter-in-law, noting the easy partnership between them that had been strengthened rather than strained by their recent trials. William's protective instincts had been channeled into productive collaboration, while Kate's willingness to be vulnerable had revealed reserves of strength that benefited not just herself but the entire institution. "What have we learned from this experience?" Charles asked, framing the question as both personal reflection and strategic analysis. "That honesty really is the best policy," Kate replied without hesitation. "Even when it feels risky, even when it goes against traditional approaches, authentic communication creates stronger connections than perfect presentations." "We've also learned that the public is more sophisticated than we sometimes give them credit for," William added. "People can distinguish between appropriate vulnerability and weakness, between sharing struggles and complaining about privileges." Charles considered their responses while reviewing the broader changes that had emerged from their crisis. The royal family's communication strategies had evolved to include more personal perspectives alongside official statements. Their public engagements had become more interactive, with genuine conversations replacing purely ceremonial interactions. Most importantly, they had established precedents for addressing future challenges with transparency rather than defensive silence. The afternoon sun streaming through the windows reminded Charles of similar moments during previous crises when the outcomes had been far less positive. The decision to trust the public with honest communication had paid dividends that extended beyond mere popularity ratings. They had strengthened their foundation for weathering future storms while serving as more effective advocates for the causes they championed. "There's one more thing," Kate said, reaching into her bag to retrieve a handwritten letter. "I received this yesterday from a teenager in Canada whose parents are going through a difficult divorce. She wrote to thank me for showing her that adults can admit when they're struggling without falling apart completely." The letter represented thousands of similar messages that had arrived since Kate's statement, each one demonstrating the power of public figures who were willing to model resilience rather than perfection. Young people especially had responded to Kate's honesty, finding in her example permission to acknowledge their own difficulties while continuing to pursue their goals. As their meeting concluded and they prepared to return to their respective duties, Charles felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond the successful resolution of a crisis. They had not merely survived a difficult period, they had used it as an opportunity to evolve into more effective servants of the people they were sworn to protect and represent. The royal family that emerged from this experience was stronger, more united, and more connected to the citizens they served. They had learned that vulnerability could be a source of strength, that transparency could enhance rather than diminish respect, and that acknowledging humanity was the most royal thing they could do. Standing again at his window as Kate and William departed, Charles watched the late afternoon light paint the ancient stones of Windsor Castle in golden hues. The building had housed monarchs for nearly 1,000 years, each generation facing challenges that seemed unprecedented in their time. But the solutions they had found to their contemporary crisis honored both the institution's enduring values and its capacity for thoughtful evolution. The weight of the crown remained, but it was now distributed among strong shoulders that understood both its burdens and its possibilities. They had not just preserved the monarchy, they had prepared it to serve with greater effectiveness and authenticity in the decades to come. The crisis was over, but the growth it had sparked would continue long into the future, shaping how the royal family served and how the public connected with the timeless institution that had learned to embrace its own humanity,